The Christians who were living around the area of the Mediterranean in the first century had glorious good news about a Saviour who had conquered death and promised a kingdom. And yet their world was becoming more dangerous and more disordered every year. By the AD 60s, the Jews in Jerusalem and Judea seemed determined to rid themselves of their hated Roman occupiers, even if that ended in a bloodbath. And the Roman emperor, Nero, was becoming more violently crazy day by day. Jesus had said, this is Matthew 24, we read it last week, he had said that within a generation, days of great distress would come on the land of Israel, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. If we ask, why is it that the world can seem to be in such deep turmoil, right down, as it were, to the foundations? Well, the answer of Revelation 12 and 13 is this, that behind the events of history lies this cosmic battle with Satan, in which Jesus Christ is the victorious conqueror. Behind the events of history lies this cosmic battle with Satan, in which Jesus is the victorious conqueror. So as we look at this, let's first of all introduce what we might call the characters who appear in chapter 12 and 13. And remember, this is a vision given to John, but the things he sees have meaning. It's, if you like, written in symbol language that people might understand the symbols. So I did ask if you had that in the notice sheet last week, that have a read of this, and I said, is it clear from the passage who any of these represent? And I don't know whether you decided it was clear or wasn't clear, but we'll have a look at them anyway. So in chapter 12, first of all in verse 2, we meet the woman. In verse 1. And in verse 2, we're told that she is pregnant. So there's a pregnant woman. Secondly, verse 3, there's a dragon. He's described as enormous. He's described as red. And in fact, that word means fiery red. He has 7 heads and 10 horns. And we learn from verse 4 that he intends to devour the woman's newborn child. Then there's the child himself. In verse 5, she gave birth to a son. He is born to be king, and we read how he is snatched away from the dragon's teeth. Over the page, there is verse 7, war in heaven. The dragon loses and is hurled down to the earth. And then, well, you certainly should have worked out at least the identity of one of these characters, because it's very clear from verse 9. The dragon is identified for us. The great dragon was hurled down, that ancient serpent called the devil, or Satan, who leads the whole world astray. He pursues the woman, and she flees to safety. And then verse 17, at the end of that chapter, having failed to harm her boy or her, he instead pursues the rest of her offspring. Well, then we go into chapter 13, which we, of course, haven't had read. In chapter 13, there are 2 beasts. First of all, we meet in verse 1, the beast out of the sea. The beast has 10 horns and 7 heads, just like the dragon. Verse 2, the beast is given power by the dragon. If you like, he's the devil's sidekick. Verse 6, he blasphemes God. Verse 7, he makes war against the saints, against the believers. And verse 8, he's worshipped by all whose names are not written in the Lamb's book of life. And we've met the Lamb already in Revelation. That is, of course, Jesus. And then, from verse 11, chapter 13, verse 11 onwards, we get another beast. This time not out of the sea, but out of the earth or the land. You remember that word that's translated earth in the book of Revelation is the word that means soil or land. It's not necessarily the world. He's out of the land. Verse 11, he has 2 horns, but he speaks like a dragon. Verse 12, it's clear that he is the sidekick of the beast, just as the beast, the first beast, is the sidekick of the dragon, who's the devil. He performs miraculous signs, he deceives people. Verse 14, he commands worship of the beast. And verse 16 and 17, under pain of death, he prevents anyone from being able to buy or to sell unless they first receive a mark of the beast on their hand or forehead, the name or number of the beast. Again, if you've been here over the last few weeks, you'll be familiar with this diagram as we think about what all these things mean. There are broadly 4 views on when the things that we read about in the book of Revelation take place. The historicist view says that each of these things we read about in the book of Revelation is worked out in history from the time the book was written through to the return of Christ. And as if you could trace through the centuries and see each of these things working out one at a time. So the historicist would say, typically, the woman is the church persecuted by imperial Rome until the time of Emperor Constantine, when he granted freedom of worship to the Christians in AD 313. And then they would tend to say, well, the child is the true church that comes later. It's those who are really submissive to Christ and his word, but who are persecuted by beasts. And they would say the beasts are different aspects of the corrupt papacy of the Middle Ages. This was a view that was very common at that time in Martin Luther's day. It wasn't difficult for them to see in all the persecution of the church and the corruption and the false teaching to see that as the beast or the beasts. The idealist is someone who says, no, we shouldn't try to match each chapter up with a period of history. These are visions given about things that are true and that keep repeating all down the ages. That's why I've tried to indicate that with the idealist in pale blue. It's not tied to particular parts. It sort of floats above history. They would say the woman is the church all down the ages. The beast could signify any political power that persecutes the church. And the other beast, the second beast, signifies false religion, especially when it reveres political power. The futurist is those who say the things that we read about in the book of Revelation are all going to take place just before the return of Christ. And so they're yet to happen unless you think we're in the last few years before Christ returns. There are lots of different views about how to take these chapters within those who would be futurist, but here's one example. They might say, well, the woman and her offspring are the church, they are the believers. The beast will be some future revived Roman Empire in quote marks, as in some kind of thing like the Roman Empire, that is going to oppose Christians in the last days. That's why some futurists got a little bit excited at the formation of the European Union, as one thing that might look a bit like the Roman Empire. I don't know what they're doing now since Brexit. They might have changed their minds about it, I'm not sure. And the other beast, they would say, will be the future head of an apostate church, a church that has abandoned Bible truth, maybe a worldwide church or group of churches, or some other kind of false world religion that leads people astray. And then we come to the preterist, which means oldist, in contrast to futurist. And that's the view that most of the things in the book of Revelation are about events that happened within just a few years of when they were written. They were future when John wrote and when he saw the vision, but then they happened, and now to us, they're in the past. As I've said before, I think that's the right view, and I could preach a sermon on each of these 4 for for these 2 chapters, and we'd be here for 2 hours, but I'm just going to now, from this point on, take the preterist view that these things are about things that happened in the first century. In other words, don't look in your newspaper now to see these things happening. Look in the newspapers of the first century, or the historical documents of the first century, to see what these things meant. So, we're going to take 1 chapter at a time. Let's go to chapter 12, first of all, where we find the dragon, the woman, and the child. First of all, the child. Verse 5, chapter 12, verse 5. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule all the nations with an iron scepter. Now, that phrase was in the psalm that we had read, Psalm 2. In Psalm 2, the Lord is speaking to the royal son about the nations that he will give to him. And he says, "You shall break them or rule them with a rod of iron." And so that Psalm 2, was understood by Jewish teachers and by Jesus' apostles as clearly being about the Messiah, the King, the royal son. And if we take it that way, then this child is Jesus. The dragon, we've already said, verse 9 makes clear that the dragon is the devil, or Satan, the one who leads the whole world astray. He wants to devour or to destroy the child, Jesus. You might immediately think of what happened when Jesus was born and Herod the Great killing all the boys in the vicinity of Bethlehem in order to try and destroy the Messiah, the Christ. You might also think later on of religious leaders wanting to kill Jesus, or even Pontius Pilate. But the point is, this is telling us that it was Satan that wanted to do this. The actions of those humans was satanic. Now, some people take satanic to mean something that's obviously, outwardly evil, perhaps associated with dark arts, perhaps involving satanic rituals. But the word satanic just means connected with Satan. And it's saying that Herod's murders were not simply driven by his jealousy, they were Satan's actions. Herod is still responsible, but nevertheless, they are Satan's actions, along with the actions of anyone else who tried to have Jesus killed. Just going back to verse 3 and 4, we see that Satan, the dragon, has 7 heads and 10 horns. The first place to look for understanding all of this imagery is the Old Testament. Daniel had a dream in Daniel 7 of 4 beasts that represented 4 kingdoms or empires that would successively terrorize God's people, working from the Babylonians all the way down to the Romans, until the Son of Man was given authority, glory, and sovereign power over all nations. Daniel's third of those 4 beasts had multiple heads. His 4th beast in his vision had 10 horns and iron teeth to devour its victims. Definitely echoes of that in this image of this dragon. And so I think again we can see that Satan was behind all the empires that attacked God's people down the centuries. Each pagan empire was, if you like, Satan in a new guise. And now he attempts to devour or destroy the Messiah himself. We see in this chapter that he's unsuccessful. Jesus was, of course, protected right through his life and his ministry. Yes, Jesus was crucified, but that was part of God's plan at the time that God chose, and actually was the defeat of Satan when Jesus dies on the cross. And then he's raised, he's ascended, and as it says in verse 5, snatched up to God and his throne. And then what about the woman then? She's the one who gives birth to the child, to Jesus. You might immediately think of Mary. But I think if you look at verse 1, you see actually the picture is about something bigger than that. Verse 1, a great and wondrous sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. I think you need to think back to Genesis 37, to Joseph's dream. You remember those dreams that really upset his brothers? One of them was of his family bowing down to him. In his dream, he sees the sun and the moon, as his dad and his mum, and 11 stars, his 11 brothers, all bowing down to him. He, of course, is the 12th star. And so I think the image of the woman is meant to remind us of the family of Jacob. Jacob, of course, was called Israel. The woman is God's people, often collectively referred to in the Bible as a woman or a mother, God's covenant bride. So this woman is Old Testament Israel, and she's New Testament church, God's people in all ages. And verse 6 says that after her child is taken up to heaven, the woman flees into the desert to be protected for 1,260 days, which is 3.5 years. Verse 7, I would say, is a bit of a flashback, because when we get to verse 13, we're back to the woman heading out into the desert. What's in this flashback from verse 7 onwards? Behind the conflict on earth, the conflict between the church and those who would attack the church, is this war in heaven. That is the deeper reality that Jesus is, through this vision, giving to John. There was war in heaven, verse 7. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought back. Who is Michael? Michael appears in Daniel. He's called a prince there. In the book of Jude, he is an archangel. That tends to make us think of a superior kind of angel, but that's not really what it would mean. It's the chief of the angels. Who is the prince, who's also the chief of the angels? Many people would say, actually, Michael is just another name for Jesus. Jesus and his servants, whether they're spirit angels or the apostles or messengers, defeat Satan and his hordes. Jesus attacks the deceiver, the accuser, the one who's led the whole world astray. When? When did he do this? Verse 11 points us to the cross. It is by the shedding of Jesus' blood. Satan is the one who accused God's people of sin and claimed them for himself. Jesus drinks the cup of God's judgment on the cross and wipes the slate clean. And now Satan can no longer stand in heaven before God and accuse God's people. He's thrown out. And his time, we're told, verse 12, is short. And verse 11 also says, not just the blood of the Lamb, Satan is defeated too by the faithful proclamation of this gospel, this good news about Jesus, by people who do that no matter the consequences. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Just notice the picture you get in these verses is the church is not a city under siege, attacked by Satan. The church, under the leadership of Jesus, is an army attacking the enemy's strongholds with the gospel of Christ. This is the great victory that will forever be something to sing about, or to shout about, as it says in verse 10. I heard a loud voice in heaven say, now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers, who accuses them before our God day and night, has been hurled down. They overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. They did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Therefore rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has gone down to you. He is filled with fury, because he knows that his time is short. So all of that taking place as Jesus is crucified and raised and ascends. And then verse 13 and 14, we're told again about how Satan comes after, attacks Jesus' bride, the church, the people of God. And he attacks because he's lost. He does that initially through the priests and the leaders of Israel, through men like Saul of Tarsus, who persecuted the church. In fact, earlier this year we were reading and preaching through the book of Acts, and we saw again and again these attacks, which we're told are Satan's attacks on the church. But just as Israel was carried out of Egypt by God on eagle's wings, that's Exodus 19, so God takes his people away from danger. When is that talking about? Well, you could say the whole of that period, perhaps the whole of that 40 years from the ascension to AD 70, but more specifically for 1,260 days, that period that's mentioned in verse 6, or as it's given in verse 14, a time, a times, and half a time. A year, 2 more years, and a half year, 3.5 years. The Jewish wars lasted for 3.5 years till the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. During that time, about a third of the population of the whole of Judea was killed by the Romans, responding to the rebellion against them. More than 1 million people in Jerusalem, according to Josephus, were killed at that time. But many Christians escaped because Jesus had said to them, Luke 21, "When you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let those in the city get out, and let those in the country not enter the city." And the Christians, believing that what Jesus had said was true, when they saw the Roman armies approaching, they did just that. They fled across the Jordan to Pella and to other places. That's what Eusebius tells us. Because, verse 17, because the Christians in Judea escaped, the dragon made war on the rest of the woman's offspring, which I think is talking about the mainly Gentile church outside of Judea, faithfully obeying God's commandments and holding to the testimony of Jesus. Jesus then has given John this vision to show the Christians of the time, and by implication all of us since, the reality behind the things that are happening in their world. They see all this turmoil and chaos, but this is the reminder that Jesus has risen and ascended, and behind the scenes, Satan is that fiery dragon who's been evicted from heaven. And when his plans for destroying the church in Judea fail, he looks for other Christians to attack. That is what's going on in their world. That's what the vision is telling them. It's telling them that Satan is, since the cross of Jesus and his resurrection and ascension, he's a defeated enemy. And actually, when we get to Revelation 20, we're going to see that he's much more restricted now in what he can do than he was then. All of history since this time has been a kind of mopping up exercise as Jesus, through his church, progressively takes the spoils. Nevertheless, it's true, isn't it? The attacks of the devil are still painful and real and still liable to crush our resolve to follow Jesus. This is telling us, as it told them at the time, be encouraged, be emboldened. God has installed his Son as king forever. He scoffs at those who think that they can overthrow his Christ. Let's go straight on. Chapter 13. And the 2 beasts. The dragon stands on the shore of the sea as 2 beasts appear. The first beast, who we might call the beast, he comes out of the sea. The other beast comes out of the earth or the land. In the Bible, beast means rulers or powers who oppose God and attack his people. Secondly, established in the Old Testament is the idea that the land represents Israel and the sea represents the nations around Israel. Israel being the land in the midst of the sea. Isaiah 17:12, for example, if you want to note that. So what we have here is a Gentile beast, the the beast from the sea, and a Jewish beast, the beast from the land. The beast, the one from the sea, has horns and heads like the beast in Daniel 7, and the heads resemble the same animals that come up in Daniel 7, the leopard, the bear, and the lion. The beast, with its 10 horns and 7 heads, of course, looks like the description we've already had of the dragon, who is Satan. He receives his power from the dragon. Now, nearly all commentators, right down the centuries, have identified this beast from the sea, this Gentile beast, as Rome, the Roman Empire, or if you think of an individual, then it's going to be Caesar. The Caesars, of course, were very like this beast. They thought of themselves as gods to be worshipped. They had temples built so that people could worship them. But this is telling us that this worship is actually worship of Satan. Verse 5. What the beast does is a direct challenge to God. These are things that should only be said about God and not about Caesar. Verse 6, the beast blasphemes God. Verse 7, he makes war against God's people. Interestingly, right through the book of Acts, we see the Roman Empire actually protecting Christians from the furious onslaught of the Jewish leaders who are determined to stamp out the gospel and destroy the church. And that is what was true for most of the period immediately after the resurrection ascension of Jesus. But eventually Rome turned against the church, especially in the last 3.5 years of Emperor Nero's reign from AD 64 to 68. David Chilton says this about Nero and the Roman Empire at that time. Both Nero and the empire were sunk in degrading, degenerate, bestial activities. Nero, who murdered numerous members of his own family, who was a homosexual, who dressed up as a wild beast in order to attack and rape male and female prisoners, who used the bodies of Christians burning at the stake as the original Roman candles to light up his filthy garden parties, who launched the first imperial persecution of Christians at the instigation of the Jews in order to destroy the church. This animalistic pervert was the ruler of the most powerful empire on earth. That is the beast from the sea. But then verse 11, there's another beast from the land, a Jewish beast, later on in this book referred to as the false prophet. This creature, verse 11, looks like a lamb but speaks like a dragon, like the devil himself. This is the Jewish leaders sold out to Rome. All their powers used to deceive the inhabitants of the land into worshipping the beast, into worshipping Caesar and the empire. This is compromised religion, not speaking the truth to power, but becoming a spokesman for the secular powers and even doing the enforcement work. Verse 16 and 17, preventing people from trading if they don't have the mark of the beast. This is, if you like, the church debanking people for the wrong political reasons, or sacking those who won't teach the new morality. This is a synagogue of Satan, as Jesus called them earlier on in the book of Revelation, leading people to put their trust in Caesar rather than the true God. All these things were happening in Israel in those final years before AD 70. The mark of the beast, which they have to have on their right hand or forehead, verse 16, probably not a literal stamp on the forehead or hand, just as in chapter 14, verse 1, the believers don't have literal writing on their foreheads. But this is about a clear allegiance, either to the emperor or to Jesus Christ. Who are you serving? Who are you obeying? If you haven't got the right allegiance, then you can't be part of the society. Well, we know what this must have meant for the Christians. This is the challenge that they had. Who do you stand with? Who are you following? The same kind of challenge to us, isn't it? your first allegiance, is it to Christ and the gospel or not? Don't let any secular government or church authority lead you to worship anything or anyone but Christ, however persuasive they are or however terrifying they are. Don't be frightened, this is saying. Don't be frightened by their power or their cruelty. You know, God knows how to keep his church out of the serpent's reach. Behind the events of history in the first century, and it's true now, lies this truth about the cosmic battle with Satan and the fact that Jesus Christ is the victorious conqueror. Christ's victory is our victory, as we're going to see more and more as we go further into this book in the weeks to come. Finally, I'm sure you'd like me to say something about 666, wouldn't you? Just before we finish. When we moved to Polegate in Sussex for me to be a curate, we had to have a new phone line installed, and they gave me the number 490666, which caused a bit of amusement or worry, depending on your view about why it happened. I've already said something about this, and I think really it's verse 18, because I think it's different from what's been talked about in verse 16 and 17. John's readers, I think, by this point will have already understood that the beast he's talking about is the Roman Empire and Caesar. But then just at the end, there's this little riddle added that would be understood, I think, by the Jewish Christians. He says the beast is 666. That's his number. It's possible that that's because the number 6 is the number of man. It's the day 6 on which man was created, and it's like one short of the perfect, complete number 7. There are other Bible 6s associated with man in rebellion against his creator, from the description of the weight of Goliath's spear through to the size of King Nebuchadnezzar's statue. There's lots of 6s in all those. It was on the 6th day of the week, at the 6th hour, we're told, that the high priests stood in Pilate's court in front of Jesus Christ, and as it were, wrote on their foreheads the mark of the beast when they said, "We have no king but Caesar." Maybe some of those things are in the mind of Jesus or John as he gives this number. But it's also true that all ancient names were numbers. We're used to the idea that we have an alphabet for letters, words, and then we have separate numerals, 1, 2, 3, 4, that we use for our numbers. But it's not been like that in the past for many people. We know, of course, the Romans used the letters for numbers, and we wonder how on earth they did maths, because it's all so complicated. But that's what they did. And it was true for Greek, and it was true for Hebrew as well, that they didn't have a separate set of numbers. They used the letters. So, for example, if we did it in English, A would be 1, and B would be 2, and C would be 3, through to I would be 9, and then J would be 10, and K would be 20, so you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, and then eventually you need some letters that would represent 100, 200, and 300, and so on. That's how their numbers worked. And so every name is a number, because all you need to do is take the letters of your name, and you know as a Greek or a Hebrew what numbers they represent, because you use that all the time, and you just add them up. Apparently graffiti was found in the ruins of Pompeii that said, "I love her whose number is 545. And as someone has said, there aren't really enough digits in that for it to be her phone number. So they're used to adding up the numbers represented by the letters to get a number for a name. Well, when John wrote, Nero was emperor. Give him his full title, Nero Caesar. Write this in Hebrew, Nero Caesar or Kaiser. Why would you do that? Well, because you don't want the Romans to know that you're calling Caesar a beast, So write it in the language you understand. Each of those letters in the Hebrew in the middle there represents a number. Add them up, and you get 666. Shall we pray together?